Good morning, everyone. I'm Cristiana PALMIERI, research affiliate at the Department of Italian Studies, the University of Sydney, where I did my PhD with Antonia Rubino on the motivation to learn. I conducted a study on the motivation to learn Italian as a second language in Australia. So this presentation today is actually selected findings of these larger studies that I mentioned. And I will focus on the status of Italian as a second language in Australia, the Italian in the Australian context, so the role that Italian language has played and still plays in the Australian context, and the role played by the Italian migration, which is the focus of this conference, in the Australian society. In terms of why do we like language? What is the appeal of a particular language? So Gilardoni argues that the appeal of a language is strongly associated to the cultural and social values that are expression of the social context in which the language originated historically. So this also means that investigating who the learners of a particular language are means exploring its motivation, its motivational features, and its capacity to expand beyond the geographical border of the country, which is the expression of the language. What we're going to do now is to take a trip, or a journey, better, in relation of Italian as a world language. And I have highlighted three characteristics, or three specific features. Italian as a language of culture, Italian, the economic boom and the Made in Italy phenomenon, and the Italian is the diaspora, which is again is the focus of this conference. So in terms of Italian as a world language, Italian is only the 14th most spoken language in the world, so it's not positioned in the first three places in terms of ranking, but a range of factors, including the presence of numerous Italian communities in many countries around the world, increases the appeal of a language which is spoken far beyond its boundaries. For instance, in the United States, Italian is the fourth most studied language after Spanish, French, and German. But the spread of Italian has recently conquered other geographical areas, such as Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Vietnam, where the presence of Italian courses is a fairly new phenomenon. And this is our 2014-2015 data. According to the report published by the ICON Consortium with the Ministero degli Affari Esteri e della Cooperazione Internazionale in 2014, Italian is the world's fourth most studied language, following English, French, and Spanish, with 1,500,000 students worldwide. So this is like a bit of a background. So I would like now to go through these three specific characteristics. So firstly, Italian is studied is the key to a culture that has been really valued in the Western world because of its historic and artistic heritage or past. And Joe Lobianco, in his keynote speech this morning, pointed out this very fact. So this characteristic that is an intrinsic characteristic of the Italian language. And we have to remember the influence of literary works of Dante, Petrarca, and Boccaccio in the 14th century, Machiavelli and Castiglione in the 16th century. So these all literary works mark the beginning of the journey of Italian as a world language. And Italian spread rapidly in Europe. Architects, artists, scholars, they really wanted to learn the language of the Renaissance. And this was followed by the Grand Tour, and Joe Lobianco mentioned the Grand Tour as well this morning, which brought to Italy European young men who traveled to complete their education before becoming the ruling class. Secondly, Italian is the language of a country that counts on an internationally renowned economy, if not an internationally renowned politics. But the economy can stand. In the late 1950s marked the beginning of an era of industrial development because of the Marshall Plan after World War II, and with medium and small-sized companies flourishing in numerous industrial sectors, laying the foundation of Italy's international reputation in the production of high-technology products. And I would like to mention groups such as Montedison, Pirelli, Fiat, Olivetti, which became internationally renowned for their businesses, which were also exported internationally outside Italy. And we should remember the international success of masterpieces of the emerging Italian cinema in the 1960s, One for All, La Dolce Vita by Federico Fellini, which contributed to boost the prestige of Italian as an international language and the prestige of Italian culture as well. And then the Made in Italy phenomenon was about to emerge, making the Italian language appeal to a number of potential learners attracted by Italy's lifestyle and its contemporary society. Nowadays, the concept of Made in Italy doesn't refer to the production of industrial or design goods only, but has become a trademark that refers not just to industrial goods, as I said, but also to a variety of other consumers' domains, such as wine production, for instance, enogastronomic tradition, which really represent strong indicators of intrinsic aspect of the Italian culture. And the third aspect, which I would like to mention, is Italian in the diaspora. Italian is the language of numerous communities of migrants around the world who have contributed to spreading Italian abroad. Between 1876 and 1976, almost 26 million of Italian migrated. And for many migrants, Italian was just a second language beside dialect. But in some ways, they needed to communicate with the migrants coming from other regions, helped in maintaining the use of Italian, even though Italian was, as I said, almost a second language for many of them. But another very important aspect was the fact that these groups of migrants shared values, habits, and customs, and in particular the importance of family ties. And this really helped to connect numerous communities of migrants disseminated abroad. And so the result is a number of little Italies, which are still around us in Carlton in Melbourne, or Five Dock and Canterbury and other suburbs in Sydney, for instance. And these various little Italies scattered around the world to some extent are still a vital representation of Italian culture, with limitation, but they still represent some aspect of Italian culture. As I mentioned before, Italian is only the 14th most spoken language in the world, but its popularity as a second language is quite remarkable. So between late 1970s and 2010, Italian institutions promoted a series of very large-scale surveys to understand why Italian is learned as a second language abroad. And the findings of these studies show that while originally motivation were related to literary interest, with some kind of a shift from Il Principe to My Brilliant Friend, but still we are talking about literary interest, more diversification has commenced to surface since the late 80s. And this new motivation to learn Italians indicate that the traditional identity of Italian, learned mainly for intellectual and scholarly interest, is now complemented by factors related to current social trends, lifestyle, innovation, creativity, making Italian a sought-after language for travel purposes, commercial exchanges, professional opportunity, and more in general, social integration in a world that is changing and is every day more globalized. Let's have a look now at Italian in the Australian context, which is the focus of this conference. So up until 2016, Italian was the most spoken language at home after English. And this was the 2016 census. The census conducted in 2011 showed a slight decrease, and Italian became the second most spoken immigrant language after Mandarin. And the most recent census, 2016, indicates that Italian is now the third most spoken immigrant language, together with Cantonese and Vietnamese. The latest census also indicates that according to self-reported ancestry, so it's always very difficult to draw a line, but it's because it's self-reported ancestry, Italians are the second largest community of non-English speaking background after the Chinese. So of course we are living in an evolving society. So the strong presence of the Italian language in the Australian society is mostly the result of the mass migration that brought to Australia a huge number of Italians. About 300,000 Italians settled permanently in Australia between 1945 and 1976, representing for several decades the first largest community of not English-speaking background. And Italians have managed to integrate very well in the fabric of the Australian society, becoming farmers, entrepreneurs in the building industry, restaurant owners, retail traders, mainly in clothing, textile, shoes, and food, of course. And but what is really interesting is looking at recent trends. And in their book on new waves of Italian migration to Australia, Mascitelli and Armillei describe a new cohort of Italians coming to Australia. These are mainly temporary visitors. In 2015, almost 30,000 Italian citizens arrived in Australia, with a large proportion of this number made of working holiday makers, students, and temporary skilled workers. And Mascitelli and Armillei describe this very well in their book. The vast majority of them are young Italians between 18 and 40 years of age, generally highly educated, with previous experience in a variety of industry sectors such as hospitality, education and training, arts, engineering, architecture, entertainment. And this new group is not quantitatively substantial, but is increasing and is becoming relevant in terms of cultural impact, as it offers opportunity to enter in contact with the Italians coming from Italy. And the other thing is that is a kind of a glimpse on the Italian society brought to Australia. And this helps in revitalizing and reshaping an already robust appreciation for learning Italian. So this background, I think, contributes to explain why Italian is now one of the most widely studied languages in Australia at all levels of the education system: primary school, secondary school, and universities. And first, it is a community language taught in Australia primary schools since the early 80s, thanks to a strong bottom-up push generated by the community of Italian migrants who advocated bilingualism. And secondly, as also Joe Lobianco and Agliani pointed out in their 2013 book, it is an European language taught in Australian secondary schools and university alongside French and German, representing the historical bond with Europe and that the Australian education system has been promoting in terms of top-down language teaching. So it's a very interesting, there are very interesting features of why Italian is so popular as a second language in this country. So let's have a look at the importance of the context, because we have been talking about the context. So what are the interrelation between the learning process or the motivation to learn a language and the context in which the learning process occurs? And to investigate this motivation, as I mentioned before, I conducted a larger study on the motivation to learn Italian as a second language in Australia. And I've interviewed Anglophone Australians. So because I was interested in this aspect, I had to exclude from my study learners of Italian origin, of course, because I focus on Anglophone Australians or people of non-Italian origin in general. So the participants of my study were enrolled at beginner, intermediate, and advanced level in two language schools or language institutions. One is WA, the Workers' Educational Association in Sydney, and the other one is Dante Alighieri Society. I've interviewed in total 68 students, a vast majority of them female students, all of them of non-Italian origin, and the very vast majority of them Anglophone Australians. And in terms of the analysis of the data, I conducted a thematic analysis which revealed a very important theme, community. And community is described as the willingness to become part of a community of Italian speakers, which is a strong motivational drive to learn Italian. And I've identified different characteristics of this community concept, which are on the white box. And I have highlighted in red the local Italian community because it's what I'm talking today, so the role of the Italian community in Australia. So the almost 41% of the respondents of my study reported contacts with the local Italian community. And you can see, because they grew up in Sydney neighborhoods with a high density of Italian families, because they went to school with children of Italian migrants, they worked with Italian people, or because they just are familiar with the Italian shops, Italian restaurants, and so forth. Main findings is that the presence of a well-integrated Italian community, one that is perceived as an asset in contemporary multicultural Australian society, contributes to creating an appealing image of Italy and Italians. So Italian is spoken in the street, Italian is learned in schools, Italian is spoken in shops, in restaurants. So all these aspects contributed to expose Anglophone Australians to Italians, to Italian culture, to Italian language, to Italian food, so representation of what Italy represents abroad in general. And so now I would like to give voice to some of the participants. I grew up around the inner west and I taught in Canterbury that had a very strong Italian culture. The Italian resonated in me, it was around me all the time. There were a lot of native-speaking Italians around. I was amused by the language because you can hear other people using it in restaurants and shops. And I thought, oh, I wish I could speak that language. So I think this really shows how being immersed in an Italian-speaking environment contributes to motivate people to learn the language. The specialty language in my school was Italian. I fell into that and I did it to year 10. And then I enrolled in Saturday School of Community Languages. Every other person in the class was of Italian background. We struck up a friendship at the time and used to go to each other's houses and have lunches. And I got in touch a lot more with Italian families, sitting in the backyard and eating. And so that made me want to continue. And again, frequenting Italian family, being exposed to what is important for us as Italian, like having a meal around the table, not in front of the TV, it's something that really planted a seed. I made friends there among my Italian colleagues. I used to go out for lunch and interact with the Italian community there. I was surrounded by them, immersed in it, and was a perfect model to me to be inspired. This is a very strong statement, a perfect model to me to be inspired. That situation triggered my interest to learn Italian. I think without that experience, I wouldn't have pursued it. So again, reminds me of what Joe was saying this morning in terms of intimacy. It's something that really fosters intimacy. Another one, which for me is quite important because it highlights not just the importance of the context, but the importance of the micro context at suburb level. I lived in Drummoyne, which is very close to Haberfield and Five Dock. These are traditional Italian suburbs in Sydney, which are very Italian, have many Italian connections. Probably if I had been in an area with a lot of Asians, I would have chosen to do Chinese. And again, this quite robust in terms of explaining the motivation which was brought about by the context. And I just want to conclude. So Italy is now widely learned by growing audiences in Australia for a number of reasons. And important also to notice that Italian is becoming much more important, not just in places where there are community of Italians, but also in general around the world, as I mentioned Vietnam, for instance, before. So the importance of Italian as a language of cultural tradition remains undisputed, but new categories of motivational drives have emerged connected with the phenomenon of the made in Italy and the products of Italian creativity. As a result, and I'm quoting Barney and Bagna 2007, we have been witnessing a profound shift related to why Italian as a second language is chosen by students. This shift has been triggered by a newly emerging perception of Italy as a multifaceted social system, able to integrate tradition and innovation and projecting an attractive and unique identity. And in particular, the position of Italian as one of the most taught languages in Australia is the result of a complex interaction of different factors that refer to a long-standing tradition of Italophilia based on Italian artistic and cultural heritage combined with the appreciation for contemporary Italian lifestyles, which includes Italian gastronomic diversity, the pleasure of the table, and the conviviality associated to it, and the made in Italy phenomenon. The appeal of all these different facets of Italian language and culture are strongly sustained by a significant contextual aspect, which is the presence of a very well-established, large, vibrant, visible Italian community, which offers on a daily basis opportunity to interact with Italians and to be exposed to aspects of the culture of Italian. Thank you very much.
For questions from the audience, if there are any. Can I ask, Lee, Cristiana, in terms of your participants, how many of them were not of Italian background?
All of them.
Are they all of Italian?
Yeah, the focus was on, because I really wanted to understand why Italian is so popular among non-Italian people. So I had to exclude all, because back then I was teaching Italian, I had to exclude all students with Italian background. Otherwise, the data would have been compromised.
Here's 1, 2, 3.
I don't know if this was part of your research, but I was wondering if you had a look at students of Italian in universities as well?
No, my study, my fieldwork was conducted in vocational education or continuing education, so Dante Alighieri and WEA. So I didn't look at university students.
Do you think there would be different motivational factors?
Well, this is anecdotal.
Yeah.
When I was teaching Italian at Sydney University, I had mixed classes with Italian students of Italian origin and students from any other background. And I would to say that these motivational drives can apply also to university students, but of course it's anecdotal. It's not supported by my data.
What was the age range?
Between 30 and 75.
And any predominance?
Predominance between 45 and mid-60s. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Last question.
I had a question about, so in the United States, where Italian language programs, I don't know if you were in the room yesterday, there
the destruction
Unfortunately
of these programs, sometimes the argument is about, well, you can only go to Italy to speak Italian, right? So what's the use of it, right? So you could learn. I mean, the common one is Spanish, and you can go
Sure.
halfway across the world, or,
Yeah.
Or many different countries.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that is part of, or had ever been part of the discourse here. It seems like it's such a different context. But
Yeah, well, in the case of my study, the very vast majority of the people I've interviewed, I think was 70% traveled to Italy extensively. So was in some ways was both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, but like what the chicken or the egg, because.
Right.
In the end, they wanted to learn Italian because they have traveled to Italy, they loved it, and they wanted to speak the language,
Right.
not the other way around.
Right.
Okay, let's thank Cristiana very much for
Thank you.